I selected this idea of agony and suffering after Prof. Duffy delivered his talk on the Eisenheim altarpiece, and I found that there was quite a lot of similarity between these two images. So I thought I would do a very basic reading of the Hector Peterson image, which was done by Sam and Zima. So when we actually look at the Eisenheim piece, you can see it is quite a monumental, quite a substantial representation of a very, very well-known biblical period of the crucifixion of Christ and the kind of Pieta scene where his mum actually holds onto the figure, which is very similar to ideas which I felt resonated with Nzima's image, which is that of the June 16th Soweto riots which took place. And we have Hector Peterson is the young man who was actually shot in the head, and his friend was actually carrying him with his sister Antoinette running alongside. So when you actually look at these two images side by side, one realizes there's a lot of value in how one understands or reads these kinds of images. And one can almost envisage the kind of Pieta scene which we see so often in biblical stories or ideas referencing Christianity as a faith, or the idea of mother and child. And here we have two very, very different scenarios. When we look at the idea of biblical themes, we immediately reference Christianity, and we reference faith, we reference so many ideas of lifestyle, and yet here we have the image of a very, very violent political scene of young black students rioting against the use of Afrikaans as a language of instruction, and this resulted in 29 deaths and over 250 students being killed. Now, when you weigh the enormity of the crucifixion of Christ, and you weigh the enormity of this type of image, almost like the crucifixion, one realizes that there's a lot of similarities. Because when you think of Christ trying to, in many ways, convert people or introduce people to a faith which was new, a faith which was not something that people wanted to readily accept. And that whole idea of converting or professing a different lifestyle, a way of life, a belief in God, was something which people were not prepared to accept. And it resulted in a violence towards people of the Christian faith. It also resulted in the violent, in a sense, murdering of Christ. And here we have an image which we look at and think of as just a political scene in our history, and yet it has a very similar kind of understanding in that talking about the language of Afrikaans was seen, the language itself was seen as a very oppressive language. It was seen as a language of the state. The state itself during apartheid was extremely violent towards specifically black people. And here you have children. And when you deal with children, whether it is an image or whether it is the use of the term child, it deals with innocence. And here you have the whole idea of so-called young innocent people marching on to a state to protest against what they felt was going to be even more suppressive, where language became the oppressive aspect in their lives. And in Christianity, the idea of believing in a new faith was oppressive to people. So there are similarities which one could actually gauge in both these particular images. So when we look at notions or ideas of agony and suffering, one actually realizes that The emotion of agony and suffering are immediate responses to the depiction of Christ when we see him as crucified or on the cross itself. However, the same response can be attributed to that of Hector Peterson. And both these images are tragic. And both of them are dedicated to particular lifestyles for humanity. And in Hector Peterson's sacrifice, in a sense, it's about a specific space, which is South Africa. So here, the notion of redemption narratives, which I speak of in terms of the Eisenhower altarpiece, these narratives depict a sweeping vision of creation, fall, and restoration that span Hebrew and Christian scriptures and are retained in this particular altarpiece. Such positions of narratives, which Aristotle claims provides for an action that is complete, the plot provides closure to the tragedy depicted, because we have resurrection. So we have the whole idea of sacrifice, we have the whole idea of suffering, and we have the whole idea of him redeeming. So there is closure. There are parameters within which the Christian faith is actually built. But when we look at the images of Hector Peterson, or the napalm bombings, or the 9/11 tragedies, this was the image taken by Nick Ut, where this child, again, is running on the street. And the whole idea of suffering and agony is immediately resonating with these particular images because we have experience, we have memory. And when we read into these particular types of images, there's particular ideas that are inherent in these particular photographs, which remain ingrained in our minds. And that is part of how we start reading the idea of trauma. Because trauma itself is just looking at how innocent children, again, are exposed to the idea of the bombing, which is a very adult thing. So when we look at how these particular figures are positioned against the soldiers, again, you have a reference to how we see the world, how we experience the world, and what we do within the world. And when we look at the image of 9/11, again, these particular images resonate with experience, with trauma, with terror. And these particular ideas are retained within the idea of the Hector Peterson iconic image. So this, again, many of us actually remember it for what it was. So here we have the tragedy itself is split between two very different ideas, where San and Zima's image on the left looks at a split between the self and the world, whereas Groenewald's looks at a split between self and God. But there are those two very distinct separations, but they exist in tandem. So these kinds of experimentations and these types of images which are represented also speak to how we read these particular images. Because when you look at the idea of us split against the world, we look at how we actually impose ourselves on the world. And when we're looking at the depiction of Groenewald's image, we look at how we assimilate and understand the ideas of the Bible. So that responsibility to our belief in God is also inherent in this particular image. Am I speaking too quickly? Are you all okay with me? All right. So when we look at reading these particular images, in the context of photography, the entrance of light through the lens suggests transfer of reality onto a photograph. It's a snapshot of reality. We know this. In apartheid South Africa, photography has, in many instances, played a part in how we represented that which was very abstract to many communities. They became snapshots of what people's experiences were. And in social documentary photographs, we find there are rather atypical focuses, usually on the experiences of ordinary people and how their lives were shaped by social and political structures under which they lived, thus creating snapshots of our history. Such photography provided a visual dimension to the anti-apartheid resistance movement and aimed to mobilize local and international responses against oppression in South Africa. Such images have primarily been associated with the production of a grand narrative of emotive political insights such as funerals, fists, banners, and protests. So this is how we see things. Not different from how people approach the whole idea of Christianity. Also the whole idea of protest. Also the whole idea of burning. Also the whole idea of violence, because it was not something that was readily acceptable to people. So when we look at this, central to the visual construction of apartheid's oppressive regime is the production of visual testimony. Because during apartheid, communities, specifically white communities, were separated from what was actually happening. And it was the whole idea of how propaganda worked, that everything was all okay, that all you had to do was separate yourself or keep boundaries. And one can understand that communities themselves remained ignorant of what was truly happening in apartheid townships. And it was these kinds of social documentary images which provided insight into things which were very, very abstract to supposedly white communities. So in this way, we talk about how documentary photographs were brought to the fore in order to also give people living in townships access to what they were experiencing. Because it's very difficult if you are in a specific township to actually complain, because you know that the police were not in favor of you being black. You know that there were policies that were instituted that were against against black communities, such as freedom of movement, freedom of where you could actually stay, freedom of actually being in the company of white people. So you have this whole idea of separation. And it was these kinds of documentary images which are important for us to understand and unpack in today's social platforms. An author or witness must transform catastrophe into an appearance of terror in order to articulate its experience. So when we actually look at, these two images, we find that Groenewald himself also had to create, by means of gesture, expressions, ways in which we could experience the trauma and pain, suffering and agony of Christ. It's not a happy image. It is the manner in which an artist, whether it's a photographer or a painter, articulates particular aspects within these particular images in order for the audience to experience what they are trying to profess. The same with the image of Sam Nzima's Hector Peterson. These particular images are framed and cropped in a particular way in order to articulate particular responses from an audience. So the whole idea of the appearance of terror is very, very important. The iconic power of a single photograph of a young boy killed by a shot fired by a police being valiantly carried by another young boy and mourned by a sister running alongside them became an image that is iconic in that you see it as monuments, you see it as T-shirts, you see it as a remembrance, not a celebration, but a remembrance of the tragic event of 1976. The image becomes lodged in the collective memory, and this is what actually happens, is that when you continually use an image, it becomes a collective image. So by one mentioning the idea of the Hector Peterson photograph, immediately you know which images we are talking about. Because the Hector Peterson was not the first person to be shot. The first person was actually a man called Hastings, a young child called Hastings Ndlovu. And unfortunately, there was no photograph or photographer to actually capture that particular moment. But this was by Nzima. So this becomes part of the collective memory that gives rise to the idea that this is representational of the 76 riots. So when we look at the image becoming a collective memory, in the same fashion, the crucifixion of Christ is also part of a collective memory. All of us understand it. All of us then have experience and knowledge of the history which actually belonged to that particular image. So in its persecution in the past and its preservation of Christian faith holders in the future, all of these types of images resonate with particular individuals. Now, to give you some insight into Sam Nzima, Born in 1934 in Lilliesdale in Mpumalanga. He was a photographer and he worked for the World newspaper when he actually took the shot of Hector Peterson with Buisane actually carrying Hector Peterson and his sister Antoinette actually running alongside him. And Sam Nzima did not really make money out of this photograph because he didn't receive any royalties. The fact that he worked for the World newspaper, all of that was vested in the newspaper. And when he took these images, during apartheid, you couldn't really put up any images you wanted to. But it was actually the editor who decided that that specific image will be utilized. And Sam actually took 6 different images, and I've got 2 of them to actually show you that when you actually take photographs, you are subconsciously or unconsciously deciding exactly what it is you are doing. It is not just a snapshot for the sake of taking mobile or cell phone images. There's a constructive way in which you decide the particular image that you would like to dictate for the audience. These are 2 very different images. If you remember the initial image that I showed you that we know so well, it is simply those 3 figures with the woman at the back. I'll show that to you just now. And this was when they carried Peterson to Sam Nzima's car and to take him to the clinic, but unfortunately he was dead on arrival. So these images we don't really see often. We always see the same Hector Peterson image, which resonates, I'm sure I've got an image here to show you, very differently. As you can see, it is framed differently. So when we talk about artists or photographers, you know, they take numerous images which actually dictate very different experiences to your audience. And if you look at these particular ones, he's captured the substantial crowds of the students, plus the police, plus the particular setting of the home where the incident happened. Actually, they were going to walk to Orlando Stadium, where there were going to be at least 10,000 students meeting, but the police actually kept them at bay. And I think it was more out of fear when the police saw this mass of students walking towards them. That, you know, it's like the same as Marikana. You know, all of these people who are supposedly threats to you, because you also, by means of propaganda, inform time and time again that these black people are terrorists, they are communists, you know, they're not to be trusted, they will kill you, they will kill your sisters, they will rape you. There's always those kinds of information which is transmitted time and time again. So, of course, being human, you are immediately open to angst or anxiety. So when you see hordes of people walking towards you chanting, you get scared. When there are protests today, we also get scared because our cars will be damaged, or we will be attacked, or shops will be stoned, things will be looted. Immediately our minds run riot. So one can understand the whole idea of police starting to shoot. So this historic event, June 16th, was a planned march, as I said, to Orlando Stadium, and students were intercepted, and unfortunately 29 students died, 250 were injured, and as I said, Hastings Ndlovu was the first to actually be shot at this particular place. But how do we read these images? We are captured by the catastrophe. When we look at what has actually happened, that whole mass of people, all the police, it becomes a catastrophe. It is not just an event. It is not just a historic event that we can put aside. And the same catastrophe can be seen for many of the wars that were unfolding in South Africa during the Anglo-Boer War itself. Those are also catastrophe because lives are lost. People's lives change during that moment. Trauma was once an experience relegated to the direct contact between catastrophe and the survivor. But media, by means of photographs, allows us to experience the same trauma and bear witness to catastrophic events. So you don't have to have first-hand experience of these catastrophes. That the media itself allows you to photograph or paint like Groenewald's painting, We did not have to be there to experience the crucifix, but in a sense we experience it just by looking at his particular images. The experience of agony and trauma by Laurie Dobb explains it as there are three distinct ways in which we witness things. One, witness as personal experience, witness to the testimony of others, like the TRC, and third, witness to the process of witnessing. So we could put on the TV and hear all these witnesses, and you are actually witnessing the witnessing of these particular events. So when we see the tragedy and trauma through the photographer who selects and cultivates the trauma for us to witness, it becomes even more powerful. Because as I said, Nzima actually took 6 images, but only one was selected. And even that particular one, I will unpack for you just now to actually show you how we could read the agony and trauma within these. So it's important to understand the aspects of witnessing, not just firsthand, not just witnessing the witnesses, but in a third, an arm's length approach to the event, which still has value in terms of the trauma and agony which was initially being transferred. So, its effectiveness and impact stem from a highly emotional register. And that happens in both the images of the Eisenhower altarpiece and the Hector Peterson, where there is an emotional response to what you are looking at. A wound inflicted upon both the mind and the body. That is what actually happened. In the Hector Peterson image, this is encapsulated in the 3 youngsters, 2 of them running in terror as they tried to escape from death while attempting to save the life of the third. In the image of Christ being crucified, it is captured in his tormented face. The crowns, all of that create the idea of the angst. And the trauma theory provides just one of the lenses through which we can actually read these particular images of both Nzima and Groenewald. Now, Dory Loeb also talks about the idea of trauma, where she says, trauma survivors live not with memories of the past, but with an event that could not and did not proceed through its completion. It has no ending, so it remains open-ended. There is no closure, and therefore, as far as its survivors are concerned, continues into the present and is current in every respect. So if we look at both of these particular images, even though the crucifixion of Christ took place so long ago, we still experience that trauma when we look at these particular images. The same with the Hector Peterson image, that even though it took place in 1976, the whole idea of not having closure means that it resonates today. 40 years later, students are still protesting with fees must fall. It is a continuation of the whole idea of that particular idea of a fight for education. So Nzima's image provides a compassionate bond between us as the witness to the event and the event itself. So there's a separation. This is further activated by the fact that the subject that is photographed is not passive, but an active participant in the event because of the manner in which it is clothed, the manner in which it is presented. This concludes a triangular relationship between the photographer, the subject photographed, and the viewer. So that in itself creates a very, very different discourse in order to unpack. So why is this image of Peterson, amongst hundreds, remain imprinted in our minds? When viewing a photograph, the viewer is aware that this is a snapshot of reality, which makes it quite powerful. A photograph, in this sense, becomes historical as it is consumed by the audience, which resonates with the information depicted. So we understand what is actually being said by looking at the image, whether it is a crucifixion of Christ, or whether it is the kind of theater scene of Hector Peterson. Such images change perceptions and opinions, because when you see that snapshot of history, immediately it tugs at your heartstrings to say, shame, because it's not then a black child, it is a child, and all children are our children. So immediately one resonates with the motherly instinct when we see that particular image. And Peterson's image represents the 3 figures as central, removing the mass of students' presence and that of the police. as you can see. And as I said, he took just the three figures which are quite central. Look at the way he has cropped them. And the figure in the background, which I talked about, which connects with the horror which is unfolding, because she's not looking at them running. She's looking at the back, which means all the trauma and all the angst that has happened is still continuing. So one reads this as an event that is transpiring. It is not a completed image. So when we look at this, we can see that Nzima has captured it in a particular way. And the horror itself continues just by having that woman placed in that particular position. The fact that she stares in that direction tells her that the violence continues. In this way, Nzima has framed history, a history which unfolds 40 years later today. And the image is also framed within the biblical idea of the Pieta, where Mary holding her dead son in her arms, which has a greater sense of being remembered, because we have that historical memory of the crucifixion of Christ, which is a religious aspect, and it tears off your heartstrings to say, this is how we should feel. So the image of suffering, agony, and horror are infused in this particular image, just in the manner in which Nzima has actually wrapped this. So finally, in Kathy Carrott's reading of Freud's text, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, she reflects that the wounds of the mind is not like the wound of the body, a simple and healable event, but rather an event that is experienced too soon, too unexpectedly to be fully known, and is therefore not available to consciousness until it imposes itself again. Trauma is not locatable in the way that its very unassimilated nature returns to haunt the survivor later on. So trauma is not something that just ends. That particular image is not something which just ends. That trauma unpacks itself in so many different ways. And that is why when we look at these particular images, there is no closure. Whether we're looking at the napalm bombings, whether we look at the 9/11 terror attacks, or whether we look at these particular images, there is no closure because of the manner in which we are represented within the world. And that is why I talked about us being separated, the self and the world. Whereas within Christianity, there is a closure because of the redemption, because of Christ having died on the cross for all Christians. So there's a closure in that sense. Whereas in these particular images, the kind of unpacking of these figures indicates that this is a continual process. And with that, I say thank you. All right. Do you have any questions? Anything I could explain to you?
I just really found it interesting. I never knew that there was all these different pictures, and when you showed them, could you go back to that?
Yeah, sure.
Because it was so amazing how very different they are.
Yeah.
How very different one sees the event if you look at them like this. There are so much less that sort of religious image than because of the whole composition.
Yeah.
And the other composition, the centrality of it, the balance of that composition, all of that contributes so much to that link with something more than just earthly.
But it's also about how we, in a sense, as audience, are manipulated. When we actually look at these things, we do not realize how things are framed, and you are directed into thinking and seeing things in a particular way. And, when I look at these kinds of images, and, sometimes you come across these films about the life of Christ, and you see these hordes of people walking. It's a very similar kind of thing. So the kind of trauma that one experiences and associates with is very, very important, because it's history repeating itself, but in so many different ways. And when I look at these particular images as well, it's about how we as humanity cares, but we still also don't care, because we are killing our own, whether it is the ideas of Christianity and persecution of Christianity, the language as well as the people. And this is happening today, 2017, across the world. You look at people who want to believe in a particular faith are not necessarily allowed to practice their faith. And so the persecution, the suffering and the agony persists. And the same with this kind of image where I talked about the Marikana shootings. When we talk about these particular images, we look at Syria and all of those masses of people looking for home. The kind of trauma and anxiety resonates amongst us in so many different ways. So that's why these particular images need to be looked at not just in a political sense, but how it can be seen within day-to-day existence of our lives.
It's wonderful how the mind works, and it's like you say, it doesn't matter how long ago this happened, 76. If you hear the name, or when you hear the name Hector Peterson, immediately you see that image in front of you because there was a photograph. And it's printed in your mind.
Yeah. That's what we talk about, the collective memory. And the same with Christ. I mean, I'm not a Christian, but I can understand and I see that because it's time and time again shown to us. The stories encapsulate exactly that existence during that time. And one can experience that kind of suffering. It's a human type of response to that. And the images have to be so powerful for that kind of angst to be retained for years on end. That it's not just that moment in time which is captured, but the kind of emotional aspect imbued in that image.
I also think with these two images make it more site-specific than the image that we know. Because here you have this car that's immediately another car that you see today, and you have a specific crowd, group, landscape. Because those figures in the other photograph are completely removed, they become more universal. And that extends their life and their time in some way. You talk about something that's going on. We know as artists we do that. We manipulate the way something is seen, but it is a great insight, thank you, about how this actually works in a series of photographs.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm glad I could bring this to your attention. I think they are really, really fantastic images. It's a pity that Nzima didn't really benefit from this. But he did mention that the Apartheid Museum did provide quite a lot of his images for view. So in that way one could really understand and see what really happened during that time.
Yes. I really like, I came a little bit late, not a problem, but sorry about that. But it really makes me think about many issues. I think you're touching about, aspects of the things that we kind of like, never really reflect too much, because there is also a storytelling.
Yes.
How we tell our stories about, what the human condition is. How, do we justify it? Or is the justification kind of like it becomes null? The moment we are confronted with that reality, and it actually doesn't matter if it's framed or not framed, because on some level, everything is a storytelling narrative that our brains are kind of like
Understanding.
Justifying, justification, But also it reminds me of that whole, Steven Pinker mentioned in one of those long books that he wrote. I don't know, he's got a talent for 600 pages books. But there was a beautiful nugget of something that really touched me. He said that with the invention of press, gradually empathy would be spread, because that was the invention that was really useful for towards literacy, towards starting to understand what the story is, and then the writers took that tool to write about injustice, about the trauma that other people experience. And then the thing is that they write in such a way that you step into the shoes of the character. And you feel the same, you somehow step into the shoes of that, young walking child. And you kind of like start to imagine what he's experiencing in that emotional link. And so, you know, I mean, and obviously visual is such more immediate, immediate medium.
You know, when you're looking at these images as well, the whole idea of empathy you speak of and compassion is also relevant here. Because when you're looking at empathy, it's about sometimes an arm's length approach. You feel for something. But compassion is where you feel so much more emotionally for what you are looking at. The experience becomes much more homely in a sense. There's a greater sense of understanding and experiencing that rather than just empathy. Empathy tends to become just a veneer of an emotion. Whereas the compassion one feels, whether it's a Christ-like image or the death of Hector Peterson, is so much more felt. So I can understand that. Yeah.
Also, according to your individual history, who you are, who your ancestors are, you have different images emerging.
Yeah.
And they don't always imbue compassion. They often imbue anger and other negative emotions too.
Yeah, being human, we experience all of that. Yes.
But there's a million different images that come to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, and that's also because of our collective memory, our historical base, as you said, from where we come. Our response to that is completely different.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, of that. Sorry,
No.
because it's such an interesting discussion.
Yeah.
And that, you know, I mean, you know, I personally, I really, you know, I mean, I'm not that I'm sort of like trying to explain everything in biology, but I think, you know, our biological roots, it's got lots of explaining to do. When you say that, yes, you know, I mean, we kind of like in groups, and then, you know, there is an anger and some other groups, that is basically, you know, the way that I see it, and I think quite few social biologists see it, is that it was a necessary thing as survivals when we were a long time ago, 70,000 years ago, in order to, you know, to survive in the group. You know, the children, the babies were brought up to the beliefs of the group. The group was bonding, you know, so it was sort of like that. And then, you know, that's the kind of like a dilemma, that it was for our survival, but is it, you know, that we still operate on those very old programming, wiring,
Instinctive.
you know, it's still very much kind of like so alive in our groups, and you know, it had certain reason. I mean, there were like maybe, you know, 100,000 people on the whole earth. They had to somehow, you know, club in together and survive. But now, I mean, the whole situation is different. You know, it's not surviving by going and killing other people. You know, I mean, I know it sounds crude, but it's, you know, it is that kind of thing that we still live by that old biology that helped us. But now there are different ways to relate to reality, different narratives to actually start thinking about and relating to.
Because today it's also geographic. You know, we talk about xenophobia, you know, these aspects become geographic, that we don't want them within our spaces. Then we look at other economic aspects, you know, in terms of job security. You know, there's a whole lot of fear again, a whole lot of angst that we bring upon ourselves, and we feel insecure, and therefore we respond in something which is almost immediate, which is violence. Yeah, so we become almost animalistic in that way, that kind of brutal way in which we existed once upon a time kind of takes precedence in a particular mob setting. Yeah. Okay. Is that... No, I just thought it's time that we must... Okay, yes. Okay. Anything else you'd like to discuss? You okay?
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing this evening. Thank you. Bye.